Let's talk a little bit about her situation. What do you think should be happening to her now?
Well, good riddance as far as I'm concerned. She is someone who knew what the Islamic State was before she went out. She put in a lot of planning, including stealing jewellery to fund her flight. She did a lot of research. She had to seek out ISIS fighters to communicate with, to actually make sure she got to Syria in the first place. So this is a young lady that shows absolutely no remorse, who knows what kind of training she's been through, and she remains, as far as I'm concerned, a threat to everybody.
She was 15 when she went. Do you not think a lot of people are arguing, well, she was clearly brainwashed. She was a child. She couldn't have made all these decisions on her own without in some way being brainwashed. Do we not need to cut a bit of slack for that?
Well, not really. She was above the age of criminal responsibility. At 15, I knew between right and wrong. And she saw, just like everyone else did at home, the images of the Yazidi girls being sold into sexual slavery, girls as young as 3 years old, young boys and men gunned down in ditches. She saw what ISIS was doing to Syria and Iraq, just cutting a sort of a bloody swathe throughout just the countryside and throughout the cities, Raqqa and Mosul. So no, I just don't get this sort of spin that certain parts of the media are sort of advocating that she's somehow a victim. No, the real victims here are the Yazidi girls, are the young men and women who have had their lives ripped to pieces in Syria because of ISIS. So for a 19-year-old woman now to bleat about her human rights and what she wants to do, what needs to happen now is the future of Syria. That's what we should be discussing.
If she had been raped, everyone would have said that she could not have consented to that when she was 15, because 15 is under the legal age of consent. So therefore, she, even if she had said that she consented to it, she couldn't have under the law. So the analogy with this surely works.
No, she married a jihadi, a fighter who knows what crimes he committed on the front line. She actually, far from showing remorse, not only has she normalised what the Islamic State is and what it stands for, she's actually justified it too, and actually shown regret that she's left the front line in the first place. She's actually seems very self-centered, and I'm actually quite relieved that her first interview was so unfiltered. I was speaking actually just recently to a Kurdish fighter who's part of the YPG, who holds the prisoners, and he said to me that the Islamic State has been briefing its foreign fighters to say just this, that they are innocent people, that they didn't mean to go out, that they were humanitarian workers, doctors, and that their human rights are being violated. They wish to come back to Europe, with the end goal being to renew the violence.
But that means then she clearly has been brainwashed still.
Well, brainwash, it takes away her responsibility as a woman. Sure, she was 15, but she's 19 now. I just don't buy that a 15-year-old can't be held criminally responsible. We've done it with that young boy that was kidnapped many years ago. Those young boys, I forget the names now, excuse me, I'm a different generation. So there's been many examples throughout our recent history. The Bulger case, excuse me. There's been many examples where young people, young men, young girls have faced up to the actions that they decided to take. And as I said, why risk it? What do we owe this young lady? She's 19 years old. The priority of government is to keep people safe in the UK, and also, of course, to deliver justice to all the people that ISIS have actually killed. So I just don't quite buy it.
If she had shown any remorse in her various interviews, would you think differently about her coming back?
Well, I don't know. I actually don't advocate that she should stay abroad. I didn't know before she was stripped of her citizenship that she was a dual national. I'm actually, now that I know that, I'm glad it happened. But had she been British, I would have said that she needed to come back to the UK to face trial. But before that, and I've been advocating it for a very long time now, we needed to stiffen British legislation. Our anti-terror laws are far too weak. Just 1 in 10 jihadis who have come back to the UK from Syria have found themselves in a courtroom. So there is already...
Why is that? Why do you think that? Is
weak laws.
Well, is it because it's quite difficult to get evidence?
Well, that's true. And that's why we need to sort of narrow down on terror groups in particular. So, for instance, just the membership of a terror group, proof that you're in their area of responsibility, you providing them material support, things like this should be the catch that we capture these people on. There was another case where a young lady went to Syria, joined ISIS, came back, got 6 years in jail and was out in 3 years. And can you believe, honestly, I've been to Syria. I've heard the testimony of young Yazidi girls who were captured when they were before 10 years old, much younger than this 15-year-old who went out to fight and join ISIS. And I wouldn't even want to repeat some of the stories I've heard from these girls. And and once you see ISIS up close, then you actually can understand how horrendous and horrible they are. So we don't owe this young lady anything, and I'd be very cautious about any returning fighters.
Des has texted in to say, I'm struck by the nasty tone of those who are unable to experience compassion. A young British-bred girl is brainwashed by a corrupt version of Islam, and the response is to turn their back. So a response worthy of IS maybe, but not of a humane person.
No, my humanity extends only to ISIS victims, I'm afraid. ISIS people are the worst of the worst. They've hit us in the UK, they've hit our kids in Manchester, they've hit our democracy on London Bridge. Anyone who goes out to join the Islamic State is an enemy of the UK, is a clear and present danger to the UK. And as far as I'm concerned, if they're a dual national, certainly they can stay out of this country.
Let's move on to your own personal story, because it is absolutely fascinating. I know when we talked before, I thought, I need an hour with this guy. Well, now we've got an hour with you. You had a very normal upbringing, didn't you?
I really did.
In fact, very similar to mine, I read.
Yeah, well, I don't know what you've read, but I grew up in Cambridgeshire.
On a farm?
Well, yes, but my grandfather was a farmer. My dad was into like property development and that sort of stuff. I've got 2 other brothers. I went to a local school, small school, and yeah, well, if you're looking for any depth to my early life, I'm afraid you're not going to find much.
No, what I want to do is to try, I want to get to the point where you made the decision to go and fight in a war zone, because I think I said this to you last time. I mean, you look an ordinary guy. You're not you don't look like a sort of war hero or anything.
Not at all.
How on earth do you get to the point of having a very normal upbringing in Cambridgeshire? You go and work in the city, and then you go to a war zone. Now, how did you get to that point?
Well, I'm morally driven. That's certainly an aspect of my character that you could possibly trace to my upbringing. I presume my parents had a lot to do with that. But I didn't go to Syria until I was 27. So as I said, and as you said, I had a very normal childhood. I went to university to study politics, so I was very politically aware. And I have to say, very early on, I started throwing myself into the deep end when it came to human rights advocacy and that sort of stuff. For instance, when I was 19, I went over to Zimbabwe to campaign against Robert Mugabe. I worked for the MDC.
No normal person would do that, would they?
No, I disagree. I think if you're...
That's a pretty dangerous thing to do at the age of 19.
Well, it was. And he did... I was working for a senator there called David Coulter, a man who I admire enormously. He's a Christian. He's one of the few white people left in the Zimbabwean parliament. He was anti-apartheid, anti sort of the former regime, the racist regime before. He was anti them, and he's got a huge amount of respect in Zimbabwe. And spending time with him and his family, learning about their struggle, what they fought for. As I said, I may not have said actually, he's a human rights lawyer as well. Just taught me a lot, and I was just seeking out, I suppose, at that time. People to support, because I wanted to travel. I wanted to stand in solidarity with people. I was young. I was studying politics at university, and I just wanted to help people more than anything else.
So you were working in the city, to all intents and purposes, very normal existence. You had a house, you had a girlfriend. What was the moment when you thought, well, I'm going to do something rather extraordinary?
Well, I suppose... It's not something, because I don't want to appear too restless, but I did almost fall into the city. I graduated more than 10 years ago at the height of the recession and everything else. It wasn't just Zimbabwe. I was working in Ethiopia. I was doing a lot of charitable work over the years that I was studying. When I graduated, then obviously in a terrible recession, I thought to myself, I've got to have a job. I literally, after university, I was particularly broke. So I just fell into the city. I worked there, as I said, for a number of years, but always in the back of my mind, having that conscience, having the desire to keep helping people. And I did take a break from work for 6 months to volunteer in the Congo, so that there was a sense of, I suppose, restlessness in my early career. But as you say, it's pretty normal.
And the moment that you decided to go to Syria?
It wasn't a moment, like a sudden urge, I have to say. So over a period of, I suppose, 6 months, the best way to describe it is, and the listeners at home, I think, will understand this, in this sort of summer of 2014, when ISIS were rising up, when Mosul fell, when we saw those journalists on their knees, we saw Jihadi John exploded onto our television screens, and ISIS was on everyone's minds, and we were just appalled. Every single week, they went down deeper into the depths of depravity. And I became fascinated with it, shocked by it, disgusted by it, horrified by it. And I was watching it every single day on my, because I worked in currency trading. My job was to advise and talk to clients. Much of my mornings, for the first few hours of the day, I'd often just be trawling through the news, seeing what's moving the markets. So I suppose I was exposed to this news more than anyone else. And then given my background and everything else, maybe it was a bit of let's say a toxic mix. Perhaps that's not the right word, but certainly something stirred inside me, and I thought to myself, is there anything that I can do? And the first thing, and I'm sure people at home would say, why didn't you just carry on working for a charity? Why didn't you go to Jordan, help the refugees there, the people who were flooding out the country in the hundreds of thousands? But one of the things I was particularly horrified about was that the British government, the American government, wasn't doing anything. The only people who were fighting back against ISIS were the local people, and they were outgunned and outnumbered. ISIS were killing them in ditches by the hundreds, capturing them in the thousands. So dealing with refugees in Jordan felt like I'd only ever deal with the symptoms of the problem. And if I actually wanted to deal with the root causes or actually stand in solidarity with Syrians, I would have to get on a plane and go find them and go and join them and fight alongside them, do whatever I could to help them.
And did you tell anyone here what you were about to do?
I did not, which in hindsight is one of the most foolish things. And again, I suppose you or anyone at home would think how silly it was not to tell your parents or your brothers. But foolishly, I thought perhaps of keeping them safe, that I would go for 6 months, that I would come back, that I knew that they would be in agony while I was out there. But then I was also torn by the fact that if I was killed out there, then their shock would be magnified by me not telling them and then getting a random call from the Foreign Office, let's say. So it's bizarre. It's hard for me to even talk about now, to be selfless, to actually want to help people. Strangers, you actually have to hurt the people that love you the most. And one of the hardest things about being out there was the fact that my mother and father, that my brothers were at home, and that I would be dead if I died, but they would live with a life sentence. So I don't want anyone to think that I was naive on this subject.
So when did you tell them, or how did they find out what you were doing?
Well, it came out piecemeal almost. I eventually told them after about a month in country, and then it was magnified by the press, which had a bit of a field day early on, which in hindsight, by not telling them and by just allowing it to be uncontrolled.
How did it get in the press?
Well, it's when you're a 6'4" white Englishman sounding like I do, people tend to start taking photos of you. So,
and what was the reaction from your family and friends? Did they think that you'd lost it?
Yeah. I mean, my family were horrified. They were incredibly shocked. They didn't know why I was there. Obviously, some friends were very supportive. I think on the whole, most people weren't, believe it or not, because it was just the fact they didn't understand why I was there. I'd never bothered articulating it to them. And of course, my background hints at it. And one of the things, actually, I hasten to say that over time is a healer, and my family are now very supportive of what I do. That was way back in early 2015. By the time Raqqa came along, 2017, by the time I was sort of campaigning in Europe, in America, for political support for the Kurds. Because, by the way, this was not just about fighting, it was about standing in solidarity with people and utilising my experiences in politics and working with humanitarian groups to actually advance their cause. So time's a healer, but yeah, the early days were pretty tough.
We'll find out more about what happened when you first landed in Turkey and then moved on to Syria in just a moment. You're listening to LBC. I'm Iain Dale. I'm talking to Macer Gifford, a former currency trader who left the UK to fight Daesh in Syria. It's 8:20. Lots of you texting and tweeting in. Kevin in East Sussex says, wow, Iain, this guy is amazing. I would vote for him. Well, you might get the chance one day. Who knows? Macer Gifford is with me. He's here because, well, partly when I interviewed him last year, it was all too short, and I wanted to have a much longer discussion with him about his experience in Syria, and that's what we're going to move on to now. We've talked about why you felt motivated to go. When you first, you landed in Turkey, I think, didn't you?
Yeah.
What happened then?
So I didn't cross over from Turkey, I have to say. I flew into Turkey, spent a day there, and then flew on to Sulaymaniyah in northern Iraq, southern Kurdistan. And from there met up with YPG contacts with Kurds.
How do you even make those contacts?
Well, bizarrely, in those early days, it doesn't happen like this anymore. In fact, and it's winding down now that ISIS is gone. But in the early days, the Kurds put out a call for international support. They didn't have any weapons to fight against ISIS. The YPG itself formed because young men and women started to stuff their pockets, their jeans pockets with bullets, grab their old their family AK, which I suppose some people have in Syria and Iraq, and they ran out to start to defend their communities. And they started to call for internationals to come out and fight alongside them. And they did this via Facebook, small media groups. And because of my access, because I was reading so much and so widely, I discovered them. So I just contacted them on Facebook, believe it or not, and they arranged for, obviously I paid for my flights, but they arranged for someone to meet me at the airport.
And when you first met them, how did you feel yourself? Because I'm trying to put myself in your position, which of course I can't, but if I was there sort of meeting these people for the first time, I would be bricking it. I was quite confident because other internationals had gone before me, so I was very confident that I was speaking to the right people. When they met me, the first thing they said they would do was show me a picture of me and say my name. So when I walked past someone who just came up to me and said hello and actually gave me the wrong name, I said, nope, sorry, and carried on walking until finally he caught up with me. And I got into the car quite nervously. There was two other Kurdish men got into the back who didn't speak any English, and we drove to a safe house, and I sort of glanced. I would glance nervously into the back of the vehicle it was basically pretending that we're having a conversation, keeping an eye on it and everything. And I was only assured when we finally got into the safe house and there was YPG flags on the wall, and I thought, actually, I think ISIS wouldn't go to this much effort to kidnap me. So I was actually assured. And from there on, you just had to... One of the things that early internationals didn't understand was you have to put all of your faith in the YPG and the Kurds. If you couldn't do that, you had no business being in Syria. Many internationals tried to go out and failed. Many stayed on the internet talking amongst themselves, telling each other how much they wanted to fight ISIS, but never got that. It's like standing on the edge of waiting to jump out of a plane with a parachute on, or doing a bungee jump. You actually have that commitment to just leap into the void, and actually not very many people can do that. Carol, by the way, if you want to phone in and ask Macer any questions about his experience, do feel free. 0345 6060973. I've got some text here. Carol saying, according to recent changes in the law, your guest should be in jail for his trip rather than being celebrated and treating like a hero. God alone knows what he did. Well, we'll come on to what he did in a moment, but it is slightly incongruous, isn't it, that we're talking about people who went to Syria to fight for Daesh, not allowing them back in the country, or if they do come back, being tried. Yeah. People do make the argument that you should be in the same position. Sure.
I disagree, but I can see their arguments. The law is quite clear. If you join a terrorist group, a listed terrorist group, you will go to jail, no doubt about that. If you, for a start, the YPG is not. It's an ally of the UK and of America. It literally translates as People's Protection Units. It's a police force, sort of a local police force fighting back against ISIS and securing people's homes. So therein lies the grey area. For me, I went out to support local people. I believe in democracy. The police, sure, have stopped me under Section 7 of the Anti-Terrorism Act. They've questioned me, but released me, presumably because they know that they've got much bigger things on their minds than people that go out to fight the Islamic State. So there it is.
Okay, so you get to the safe house. You don't have military training, as I understand it. So how did you get training from the Kurds?
Yeah, well, I back in 2015, it was a very different environment. ISIS was still growing. The Kurdish military was still a bit of disarray. They'd tried a few counterattacks in the months leading up to my arrival, which had failed terribly with significant losses. Yeah, the advance of ISIS was ongoing. I think they had just taken Palmyra just before I arrived. So I arrived at a state of confusion. I only had about 1 week to familiarise myself with Kurdish weaponry and that sort of stuff, which is sort of Soviet weaponry, as people can imagine. But I met for the first time the first few hundred internationals that would eventually go out to Syria. And actually one of the blessed things that actually happened to me when I first arrived was I did very, very little for the first few months. I was packed off to a front line, but it was a front line where ISIS was still only a mile away, and where I was, it hadn't quite moved in a while, at least sort of 3 months or something. So there was not even a mortar whistled over my head for the first month or two. So I was with about 80% in those days of internationals had military experience. Some incredibly talented people. A friend of mine, Nathan, he was a British guy, had been in the French Foreign Legion for 7 years. He'd in 2-Rep, had just come out, and the first thing that the internationals decided to do was to start, because they came from all around the world. They had very different levels of military experience, and often somewhere in the French military, British military, American military, they had to actually establish a common understanding of how they would operate out there. So for the first couple of months, it was actually just fantastic to be with other foreigners, training alongside them, and coming up with a plan.
Where had they come from?
Everywhere, as you could possibly imagine. They came from America. They were former servicemen who'd fought in Iraq. They were British men, some with military experience, some without. And
were they thrill seekers?
There was a real mixture. Internationals, in the early days, I went out and I was quite clear with the Kurds that I wanted to fight alongside them. I wanted to at least do that. But the more that I could do, or the value added, was to utilise the fact that I had a voice in the UK, that I could come back and talk, to articulate what they couldn't. Because one of the things I identified pretty quickly was the fact that they are suffering from a PR problem. This is people that... By the way, there's not just the YPG, it's the YPJ as well, which is their female equivalent. They have feminism at the very core of everything they do. They believe in democracy. They believe in secularism. They believe in a unified Syrian state without Assad, obviously, but one that's democratic. So their story is one that is absolutely remarkable, and their heroic resistance from ISIS to actually stop them in Kobani and then eventually start turning them around and then get international volunteers was a story that I wanted to tell. But as you can imagine, if internationals are coming from around the world, all kinds of people were sort of turning up.
25 to 9 here on LBC. We're talking to Macer Gifford, former currency trader who left the UK to fight Daesh in Syria. We'll come to one or two of your calls in a moment. In fact, I'm looking forward to the first call, which is actually from Abil in Kurdistan. We'll come to that in a second. What made you think, Macer, that you could actually be a fighter? Because I know, if I can't really put myself in your situation, and I think it's very different. If there's a war situation in your own country and you have no alternative but to fight, you will fight. But when you got there, how confident were you that you could actually hack it?
Well, I was very confident. Look, fighting, there is such a thing as a just fight. If you see what ISIS has done, as I did on the news, there's instant sympathy, and there's actually a lot of people willing to go out of their way to help others. And just look at look at the Spanish Civil War, with internationals from all around the world going to fight against the fascists there. And ISIS is a fascist organisation. It butchers people. So it's quite unsurprising that hundreds of internationals went to go and fight them too. So history does tend to repeat itself in that regard. To be honest with you, as far as you can be confused about me wanting to fight ISIS, I am almost confused that people find it confusing.
Oh, really? Oh, that's
I really do. I spoke to one journalist who looked me in the eye and who said he couldn't understand it, and I gave the analogy.
Most people think you were barking mad.
Possibly, but hear this anecdote then, at least, or this example. I said to this journalist once, if you were in your house and you heard a commotion in the next door neighbour's house, and you peeked through the window and you saw a man banging on the door of a house of a young family, what would you do? Would you just sort of sit back and let someone else deal with it, call the police, or would you sort of call the people who are getting their door kicked in and say, I'm so sorry, you've got my sympathy, obviously, for what's happening to you? Or would you pick up your own baseball bat and would you go around and actually make certain the wolf is away from their door, or actually go and help them? And the journalist in question said, oh no, you wouldn't do that. I thought, are you crazy? Are you mad?
Well, I probably would do that. I'd like to think I would. Yeah. But I wouldn't travel 2,000 miles to risk my life.
And for ISIS. Well, I don't know. I just, at the end of the day, the Brits and the Americans weren't doing anything. The Kurdish people were fighting back, and they weren't winning at the time. ISIS was winning. And who knew where they were going to go next? Turkey. Were they going to be in Lebanon? Were they going to be in Jordan next? How far was this so-called caliphate going to grow? And I just couldn't sit around in the UK and watch it all happen.
Right, let's go to Alan, who's phoned in from Erbil in Kurdistan. Alan, what would you like to say?
Yeah, hiya.
Hi.
Yeah, I'm agreeing with most of what Macer's saying. I was speaking to Yazidis yesterday, victims of Daesh, and they're all asking about where's the justice, and people seem to be forgetting all of this, you know. You've got hundreds of Daesh that are still here, hundreds that have returned to the UK to walk our streets. You've also got the Kurds now. They need protection and they need support from the West to deal with this problem. This is only the start. Daesh isn't finished. There's insurgency already started in Iraq, and there'll be one starting, I'm sure, in Syria as well soon, in the likes of Rojava and what have you. You know, so the threat it's far from over.
What are you doing in Erbil, Alan?
I'm doing a documentary now, so the camera is the weapon. Basically, I'm interviewing the people that fought against Daesh from day one, the victims of ISIS and Daesh themselves, their mentality. Show people what their mentality actually is. People still don't understand it.
Well, I look forward to seeing that. When will it be coming out, do you know?
Oh, how long is it? I'm on what you call Kurdish time. It's taken a long time. This has to get right. You have to get to see the right people. There's just so much to it. It's just too complicated to do in a month, 2 months, 3 months. You have to put a lot of time and effort into it.
And I don't know if you've...
And you have to build up trust.
I don't know if you've interviewed people and asked them what they think of the foreign fighters that have come to fight for the Kurds. And what's the general attitude?
Well, basically, the feeling, I was going around the camp yesterday, and I was also speaking to the director of the Yazidi Kidnap Rescue Centre. The crimes were committed here. The trials should be held here. Justice should be done here. And the local laws should be used to deal with these people. These people left the West. You've got to remember, most of the Western Daesh, they're well educated. They tasted, they know what democracy is. They're actually more committed to the so-called caliphate and the ideology than a lot of the local ISIS who joined for different reasons. Whereas Western Daesh tended to join purely because of the ideology. So people here, they want justice done. The crimes were committed against them on their soil. Another thing is, we've got the people screaming about Daesh rights, getting them back to the UK, etc. However, what about you've got British soldiers that have been getting investigated and all the rest of this in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Northern Ireland. Yet we've got hundreds of Daesh that's returned to the UK, freely walking the streets. Now, where's the investigations? Where's the investigators been sent across here, the lawyers, to investigate the people that have returned to the UK?
Yeah, well, good question. Alan, thank you very much indeed. That's Alan calling in from Erbil in Kurdistan. Let's quickly go to Christine in Shepherd's Bush. Christine, you've got a question for Macer, I believe.
Yes, I have. I've been listening with absolute fascination and great admiration to your guests. And before I ask my question, can I quickly say, those who are suggesting that the fact that you went out there, you are equally should be tried along with the likes of that particular young lady. Could I just remind them that this isn't the first time that foreigners have gone off to fight in a just war. My own father went to fight the fascists during the Spanish Civil War. He was an Irish national, and then in 1939 he joined the British Army simply because he knew he was fighting a far greater evil. But he wasn't fighting, going there to fight with people who hated this country. And that is the huge difference, which people seem to be forgetting. But anyway, my respect to your guest. But could I ask, what does he feel about the lack of support that the West and Britain in particular have offered to the Kurds? For all they've suffered, the West has really helped them very little.
Okay.
Yeah, well, and bless you. Thank you so much for your kind words, and my utmost respect to your father as well. He seems like an amazing person. I have to say, the lack of attention from the rest of the world on the Kurdish cause has been pretty appalling. Britain and America... For decades, absolute decades. And the past few years in particular with ISIS, the rise of ISIS, the destruction of Yazidi communities, the destruction of Kurdish communities as well, it's a stain on our conscience that that local people with very little resources are the ones that are fighting ISIS, who are our enemies too. And although ISIS wasn't Britain's fault, we have done things in our foreign policy and other things that have contributed to the rise of ISIS, namely, for instance, the aftermath of the Iraq War, these sort of things. So if we had anything to do with the rise of ISIS, anything whatsoever, then we should be the first people to stand forward and help the people who are fighting back with small arms, with political support, with humanitarian aid. But nothing is going over there. There is obviously the coalition now, which is doing wonderful work, particularly America. But what I want to see from Britain is a clear plan to help rebuild Syria, a plan to recognise the Kurdish people, recognise the SDF and their political aspirations, and really come up with a pathway to peace and help Syria get back on its feet.
Well, in a moment we're going to talk to Macer more about his experiences of fighting in Syria, and I hope we're not going to run out of time, because I feel maybe I should have come to that a little bit before. But anyway, that's Macer Gifford with me until 9 o'clock. It's 8:45. 8:48. We're talking to Macer Gifford about his experiences in Syria. Kate in Tufnell Park has got an interesting question for you, Macer. Kate, what would you like to say?
Oh, hello. I'd just like to ask if you worked alongside, is it the Peshmerga women?
Oh, I work alongside the YPJ, which is the Women's Protection Units. So so go on.
I saw them. I've actually kept the picture of them. I know it sounds pathetic, but in March the 26th, 2016, there was a great line in the paper about them, and one of the girls said, "If I die, I want to look pretty," because she had her makeup on. I just feel so proud of these girls. I just wondered what it was like, what they were really like.
Yeah.
Because
Well, to answer your question, I was alongside the YPJ, and the Kurdish people are a remarkable people. One thing you must understand is that the Peshmerga are in Iraq, or in Iraqi Kurdistan, and they're fighting against the Islamic State and with great heroics there. In Syria, it's the YPG and the YPJ, which is actually sort of a different fraction of Kurds. And the YPJ are an all-female force. They've been fighting ISIS from the very beginning. It's very much part of the Kurdish ideology to have men and women fighting together. As I said before, feminism is very much part of their sort of belief, their core beliefs. And these women are absolutely remarkable. I can remember one time being shamed by them, quite frankly, at how brave and wonderful they are, which actually goes to show you that the real heroes in this story, by the way, are the local people. It's not the internationals. We went out there to help, to fight alongside and to draw attention. Now, the YPG and the YPJ, they've been fighting from the very beginning, and they'll stay there because they're fighting for their homes and they're fighting for their people and everything else. And I can remember one instance coming up to a village called Til Nazri in northern Syria, and it was in the middle of the night. I thought that it was falling to pieces because as we left our trench and started walking towards the village, which was about 400 metres away across open ground, a tank came up behind us with its headlights on and illuminated us like you wouldn't believe. It was like day again. But nothing happened until we got about 30 metres away, and then all hell broke loose. And I hit the deck. I was lying on the ground. To begin with, I was firing back, but the fire was so intense that you couldn't move. You could hear the bullets
from the tank.
And it was coming from the village. The fire coming from the village,
I see, right.
And it was pinging off the tank. The tank, in fact, actually reversed and left. It fired a few shells into the ISIS village, but left us because I think they possibly worried about an anti-tank missile being fired at it. So they left us 30 meters away from the village, pinned down and getting shot up. And I can remember in one moment turning and looking and seeing a YPJ girl, 18 years old, stand up with an RPG and fire it straight into the village and then dive down back onto her belly. And these YPJ girls were there as well. And I fought alongside them throughout the years that I was in Syria, including in Raqqa, clearing buildings with them, moving forward through alleyways, up stairwells, in the middle, most of the time in the middle of the night. And I was just astounded by their bravery. So I'm not surprised she's heard of them.
When you talk about clearing buildings, I mean, if you were in the British Army, you'd have weeks of training about how to do this, what to look out for, and all the rest of it. Were you doing it blind?
Well, you do it the Kurdish way, which is, certainly towards the end, the Americans had provided the Kurds with a homemade device which you could throw into a room, and it was like a percussion device. It would blow up the entire room, and anything inside it would blow up as well. That wasn't just an anti-personnel, mind you. One of the biggest risks of clearing a building was the IEDs, particularly in Raqqa. It was you couldn't move. Dozens of people within my unit were injured and killed by IEDs. So, you have to do it. So the foreigners, even those, and believe it or not, the foreigners without military experience did much better in Syria than the guys with military experience.
Why was that?
Well, the reason for that was the military guys couldn't quite hack how the locals were doing it. They couldn't believe that they were the operations in which you would lose 20%, 30% of your unit. There was no chance of medical evacuation. There was no air support. There was no tank, no armoured personnel carrier that will take you forward or even take you back. So I suppose it was those that really learnt the local language, that immersed themselves in Kurdish culture, were the ones that really thrived.
I don't know how freely you can talk about killing people, but...
Well, the truth is, I haven't. Well,
you didn't kill anyone?
Well...
What was the point of it then?
What's the point of it all? Well, it's messy. And look, and this is what I've always said. I may have killed somebody, but did I see a man stand up in front of me and did I shoot him dead? No, I did not. I went on dozens, hundreds of operations in the years that I was in Syria. I've been shot myself. My body arm was hit by a bullet. Men have died next to me. And literally died in my arms. So I've come as close to the Islamic State as possible. In Raqqa particularly, they were on the other side of the street. You could hear them running up and down the buildings next door to you. They were screaming at us in anger. The air support would come in so close that we were in the kill zone of it. It would bring our building down as well. So we were incredibly close to ISIS, but And although I fired my rifle at every flash in the dark, every blur of movement, every shadow, even though I tossed grenades, fired RPGs, and most of the time worked as a medic, if I'm honest, I didn't know if I ever shot someone. And I'm not the kind of man who would ever brag about it. I'm just not interested, and I didn't go there to kill. I went there to be stand alongside people. Because
I was reading an interview that you did about 18 months ago where you said you wouldn't hesitate to pull the trigger whenever you had the chance. Were these shootings murder? Not at all, he says. This was ISIS. I don't consider them people. I'd shoot a rat in a hay barn with more emotion.
Well, maybe I was being a bit coarse there. But no, it's certainly true. That's perhaps an unfiltered interview with me, but it's true. At the end of the day, I wouldn't have hesitated for a second to shoot ISIS, and believe me, I would have tried.
And when you were shooting, when you were in those situations, I mean, obviously the adrenaline must be flowing. I mean, what does it feel like? What were you? Was there a thrill that you were experiencing? Sort of almost a high?
No, you're sort of. It depends the circumstance. I've described sometimes you've got a sort of a fearometer, which goes up and down according to how much someone's shooting at you. Sometimes when you're running between buildings and you're actually sort of advancing to contact, I suppose you could say, sometimes it feels for a second that that something's driving you forward, that you're finding strength from somewhere, and it's very hard to describe. You react instinctively and quickly. Sometimes you think to yourself, why am I doing this? There was one time where I was crossing a road with two other guys, and we were ambushed by ISIS. The first guy got shot and died straight away. The other guy was badly injured. I ran off the road, and when I realised that one of the guys was still alive out there, I went back and got him. And that feeling of being back on that road was like, honestly, was like my heart was in a vice. I could barely breathe. And I can still remember to this day the feeling of my chest filling my body armour, so much so that it felt like my body armour was like a vice, like it was squeezing me in, and I could barely breathe. And I just grabbed the guy by his shoulders and dragged him off, and nothing happened. Shortly afterwards, about 2 minutes later, they started actually shooting the body of the other guy, and they attacked us. But yeah, I mean, you do things almost without thinking.
What was the nearest you came to being killed?
Being shot myself in my body armour. I was in the same incident, in fact. So I was with my commander. We were crossing the road, and he just said, "Let's go." And we started going quite quickly, and suddenly all hell broke loose. Basically, ISIS, I heard this later, someone else told me that ISIS had been coming down the road, and they were only about 20, 30 metres away, and they shot left to right. Commander died first. The second guy was hit, and he would die later after I got him off the road. And then I was already spinning on my heel. In fact, I hit the dirt face first. I smacked into the ground, and I didn't even know that I'd been hit. I actually crawled off the road, went into a building, and it was only shortly afterwards that someone pointed at my magazine vest, and I looked down, and a bullet had ripped through my webbing, through one of my magazines, sending all the rounds were rattling around inside, and out the other side, and I survived by inches.
Pam says, please ask him about the 21 Coptic Christian Egyptian men ISIS killed on a beach. Did this make him go? It affected many of us. He's very brave.
Well, it's yes, well, all of the above. The things that motivated me the most, I suppose, was Jihadi John. The fact that this British guy was there, a British man from London, had gone all the way to join the Islamic State, and now he was cutting off the heads of journalists and aid workers. There was an intense amount of anger. And just frustration that Britain, if I was the Prime Minister of the UK, I would have bombed ISIS until their heads spun. I would have had 3,000 British Marines on Sinjar Mountain getting the Yazidis off. There was 20,000 Yazidis dying of thirst, and I was sitting there watching it thinking, who is going to help them? And believe it or not, it wasn't just the YPG that went. It was actually the PKK as well, which is a registered terrorist organisation in the UK that left the mountains of northern Iraq and rescued the Yazidi girls. Off the mountain, I mean. And then other things, the girls in cages and the men being drowned in cages. So it was just the utter horror and the depravity of ISIS that made me just want to go out and fight against them.
Well, I've got a lot more questions for you. So, executive decision, as long as you're happy, will you stay over
more than
a few minutes? Because I think we've still got a bit of ground to cover. LBC, what a great interview on LBC at the moment with Iain Dale. I could listen to this guy for another hour. It's fascinating, interesting, and an incredible insight. Well, that's the reason we've kind of kidnapped Macer, basically, in the studio for at least another few minutes, because there's so much that I want to cover with him. Let's, if you've just tuned in, because I know often people do tune in at the top of the hour, Macer is a former currency trader who left the UK to fight Daesh in Syria, and we've been talking to him about his experiences there. Macer, you were on the front line when Raqqa was liberated. You witnessed the exodus of hundreds of ISIS fighters. That must have been quite an experience.
Yeah, it was actually kind of the end for me, because if you remember that I went out, 2014, let's say I arrived 1st of January 2015, and I'd seen ISIS grow. It had motivated me to go out. I then spent 3 years fighting in little villages, little hamlets, in desert environments, flat fields, in mountains, because Syria's a beautiful country, and I've spent a long time sort of alongside not just Kurds but also Syriacs, Christians, Arab units as well, Yazidi units as well, that are all joining together, because the group that I would eventually join is the SDF. And so by the time Raqqa came along, it felt like the end of the so-called caliphate. It was their military capital, if Mosul was their cultural capital. And although obviously ISIS has lasted for another year or two after the fall of Raqqa, that was the real last defense, the last way they could ever say that they were a functioning state. So going into the city for the first time, it was a siege-like mentality. There was still about 5,000 to 6,000 ISIS fighters in the city. There was about 10,000 or so, 15,000 SDF on the outside. Hundreds of American troops at this point now calling in airstrikes. The sky was full of planes and drones. 24 hours a day. The contrast between then and when I first arrived in Syria, when you wouldn't see an American soldier, you wouldn't see a drone in the sky, was just chalk and cheese. And then they also had supplied us with the ability to call airstrikes as well. So, and then obviously the YPG had professionalized over the 3 years. They had better equipment. So it was just incredible going to the city for the first time, fighting through streets for the first time for me, high-rise buildings, shops, huge amount of civilians.
What was it like? I mean, because all the television pictures we see, and I think that's one of the weaknesses of this conflict, that television pictures are actually quite hard to get. When you saw the conditions, the wreckage of all the buildings, the living conditions of those that had been living there under ISIS rule, tell us a little bit about that.
Well, the city did get devastated by the fighting. Entire buildings would come down, so we would go into a building, for instance, and we would sort of bunny hop. We'd take one building, then someone else would take another building, and sometimes an entire building would be rigged with explosives, and it was literally luck. Your unit goes into one building, you'd see another unit come into your building first, you'll shake their hands, you'll give them whatever water they need, and they'll go to the next building, and then bam, an enormous explosion would go off, and 5 or 6 sort of shattered bodies would come back. And it was incredibly random. The violence was it was just random, sudden. It was bloody. Hundreds and hundreds of YPG fighters were killed in the city. And so by the end, and to answer your question more directly, when I got to the hospital, and we'd already broken their defence by this point, the city had fallen into what I would almost describe as a hostage situation, whereby ISIS had, the front line had collapsed. They'd gone into large places like the hospital, like the stadium. They had hundreds of prisoners, including young Yazidi girls, as hostages, and we surrounded them. And we had a choice: we either assault these fortified locations, suffering our own casualties, and also risk the death of the hundreds, if not thousands, of captured innocents, or we allow the ISIS fighters to leave the city as broken people. And the decision was made to let the few hundred survivors go.
And presumably there's no interaction with them?
Well, I did. There was 1 minute we were fighting. In fact, the day before, the closest person who died to me towards the end was the day before. I think it was about 12 o'clock in the morning or 11 o'clock in the morning when they said to us to stop shooting at ISIS. And then the previous evening, one of our guys had been shot by a sniper and killed. And it was just incredibly sad because he was the last guy I knew in the city to die. And the next morning they said to us, it's over. Stop shooting at them. They're going. We're going to send buses to go pick them up. And slowly around the city, people started to emerge onto the rooftops because and it was ISIS that did it first. I remember someone excitedly ran up to me and he said, look, look, look. And I looked out the window at the hospital, and there was an ISIS fighter just sitting in the window without a care in the world, where just the day before we would have shot him without even hesitating. And I was just almost afraid. Like, it had been programmed into me for so long that to fear going outside, to fear going on the rooftops, to fear standing in a window, that I sort of emerged onto the roof, and I saw other people around the city emerge onto the roof. Flags were being risen, and then it started to become real as we saw them limping around outside the hospital, getting into these buses, and then they started to burn things. They started to burn all the paperwork, all the documents of their sick state, and smoke plumes emerged all over the city, the stadium particularly. You can even hear the gun. They started to burn ammunition as well, so a crackling of gunfire emerged as well. But they were just burning their stores because they didn't want us to have it.
And when did you decide to come back?
Pretty much straight after that. I felt like I'd done. 3 years, ISIS was growing when I arrived. They were limping out of the capital city when I left, and I just wanted to come home because I want people at home to understand I didn't go out just to fight. Fighting, I've always said, is the least that I did, because I wanted just to fight alongside the people who were the real heroes to me, which are the Kurdish people, with the Syriac people, with the Syrian people, with the Arab people. And I wanted to do what they did. I wanted to stand in solidarity with them. But much more than that, I could come home now after Raqqa, and I could start telling my story. I could start working with the Kurds. I could start traveling. I do a lot of writing, articles. I've written many articles over the years. I've taken part in documentaries. I've done videos that have gone viral. I've got a large social media presence. So it's all about just articulating the Kurdish experience in my own way, which is a British way, which is a way hopefully people can understand.
And how difficult was it to adjust back to normal British life? And what happened when you came back? You said the authorities questioned you. How did that come about?
Well, they've questioned me a few times. To be honest with you,
probably waiting for you outside after this interview.
Well, possibly. I just hope common sense prevails. I've said to them, and I've said to any journalist who's asked, that at the end of the day, I've always been honest from the very beginning. Except maybe possibly to my parents in that first month, as people just heard. But to the authorities, I've been very, very clear. I will give you whatever you need. And at the end of the day, if it's a crime to fight the Islamic State, then I'm guilty. But I will stand up in court and I will drag you all the way to the Supreme Court, because obviously it is an illegal grey area. But from a moral perspective alone, I am so comfortable with what I've done.
What's next for Syria?
Syria for the first time, I'm starting to feel some hope in Syria. Syria's been a terrible, terrible thing. Millions have died. People's lives have been ripped apart. A beautiful, beautiful country has been ripped apart. Its history eradicated, and just the sort of, it's not just ISIS, but other jihadi groups as well have poisoned a generation. So with such a terrible sort of past, I now want to look to a future which is actually more progressive, which actually can unite people. And now 30% of Syria, that's sort of east of the Euphrates, which is liberated by the SDF, the group that I was with, is now American-backed. Although now the Americans are talking about pulling out. Those places, kids are in school now. I've gone to the villages that I fought in, and I've seen kids and families back in their houses.
Have been back.
Funnily enough, over the years, I would go forwards, and every time I went back again, life was emerging in the areas that we were liberating, sort of thing. It's hard to describe. Certainly, if you go way back to 2015, all the villages that I fought in, all those houses where I held friends who died, kids are in them. Families are in them, and life is going on in Syria now, and it's going on under the Kurdish people, and it's quite remarkable, and that's what we need to support. If we somehow leave Syria to Assad, to Iran, to Russia, if we allow the jihadis to come back, or if we allow the FSA, which has now been corrupted by jihadism, to flourish and to stay in Syria, then we've really lost this war. And it was all for nothing.
So what are you doing now?
So I'm a student, again, believe it or not. I'm doing a master's in security, peace building and diplomacy. I've focused primarily on being a diplomat for the Kurds. Just yesterday I was with Ilham Ahmed, the president of the Federation, the Liberated Areas. She's in London at the moment, speaking with the government. I'm due in America quite soon. I'm just doing all I can really to spread the Kurdish message, to educate people and to pressure the British government, part of which is my work with an APPG, a Kurdish all-party parliamentary group. So I spend a lot of time in the British Parliament advocating for Kurdish issues.
Let's finish off by just running through a few texts that I've got here that people have sent in over the course of the last hour and a quarter. Jason in Bristol says, how do we know your guest upheld the rules of the Geneva Convention? How do we know that war crimes weren't committed? The British Army adheres to the Geneva Convention and has the moral compass to identify when it's transgressed. There seems to be the assumption that my enemy's enemy is my friend, so it's okay, but is that true? I'm very uneasy about what he did.
Well, the British Army wasn't there. Let's not forget that it was the Kurds that were fighting ISIS. They were our only people on the ground, the only people who took it to ISIS.
Did they subscribe to the Geneva Convention?
They signed up to the Geneva Convention. It's a large military organisation.
And again, if you'd been in the army, you would have had training on all of that. You'd have known exactly what the terms of it were.
We were there to say we were liberators. There was times where we would go into villages and people were ecstatic, taking off the burqa. They were running up to our vehicles and cheering us as we drove past. This was a genuine liberation. It was nothing. It took the American and British men that had served in Iraq by surprise, because former military guys were joining the internationals, and where they were once driving through Baghdad and Basra and other places in armoured convoys, fearful of the local population and the insurgency, suddenly they were in Syria being mobbed by Syrian people saying, thank you so much for coming and helping us. So, but me, I went there to help Syrian people. The Syrian people invited the internationals to come. So we, of course, abided by the Geneva Convention.
Martin from Twickenham says, what a humbling and inspirational listen this has been. If only I had the courage and fortitude of your guest. We all owe a great debt of gratitude to people like him. This one's anonymous. If your guest was so committed to fight ISIS, why is he back here to enjoy the Western democracy and benefits when he can see his quest through by helping the locals? Also, how many people did he maim, injure or kill? Further, did he harm any innocent people knowingly or unknowingly? He should be held to account.
Well, I went to fight the Islamic State. I was alongside Syrian people, the ordinary Syrian people of the SDF, Arab, Kurd, Yazidi, who were fighting against ISIS with American support. I did not go out to harm people, quite the opposite. I went out to protect people. And any comparisons with me and ISIS are just plain wrong. It's just not who I am as a person.
Well, I could spend the rest of the hour reading out texts and tweets praising you, few criticising you, but I'd say it's sort of 90-10 in percentage terms. Macer, it's been an absolute pleasure, and thank you for being so open. And I think we've learnt an awful lot about what's happened in Syria over the last few years.